Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Brennan. Good morning, Beverly.
Good morning.
Good morning, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm in my basement dungeon of a bedroom slash office, and I have both dogs, but they're quiet, so I'm winning. I think one of my children is still asleep, and one of them is awake and quiet. So we're winning over here.
That is really good. Yeah, my kids are with Catherine right now, hopefully roller skating around. So I am grateful to have a bit of time apart from the madness, and then I'll dive back into it as soon as this is done. But in any event, and how are you doing, Beverly?
I'm great. It's a little early here.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of the country than on the coast there, but I'm fine.
Well, and we are so grateful that you are not only up early, but willing to join with a pair of folks, biblical scholars who cannot hold a candle to not only your teaching ability and your research ability, but of your record of publishing. We are really, really grateful to have you on. Everybody, if anyone doesn't know who this is Beverly Gaventa. She is not only a renowned professor and a scholar of Paul, but covers the New Testament more broadly. And today is with us to help us dive into the fourth chapter of Philippians and conclude our office hours Bible study. We're thankful to everyone who has joined with us so far on our journey through Philippians. We'll return to this at the end, but just a brief announcement that this is our last week of meeting in this particular configuration talking about Philippians. We're going to take a break next week for Memorial Day weekend, and then we'll be back to talk about Job for 5 weeks after that. So in any event, Beverly, we have the kind of tradition that we've started here on office hours, and that's that we recognize that none of us reads the Bible alone, kind of by ourselves. We generally bring to our reading our lenses that we inherit. Some of them we kind of choose and get to tinker with. But so we usually ask the question, what kind of hermeneutical presuppositions or what kind of theological presuppositions do you consciously bring with you to reading biblical texts?
Well, first of all, let me thank the two of you for having me and for doing this work. My own congregation, University Presbyterian Church here in Austin, has been using this in our faith and life class, and folks have appreciated it very much. So hats off to both of you for your work on this. So I've been watching you every week, and I know that some of the things folks have said, with which to which I nod my head. Yes, we all read from our own positions, and we bring our own experience to our reading, and our life experience, our gender, our station, our race affects how we read. So I would just want to add a couple of things to that are important to me. One is that we never read the same text twice. Once in a while, I get somebody who wants to pick a fight and say, well, why is there such a thing as New Testament study anyway? We've had this text for 2,000 years. What can you possibly have to say that hasn't been said?
Right.
One answer to that is, well, we have a lot more text than people had 1,000 years ago. We have information, we have material remains, archaeological remains that we didn't have. But the other is we have different lived situations. And the most obvious illustration of that is that we're all asking questions we weren't asking 4 months ago. We literally do not read Philippians the way we read it 4 months ago. Well, literally we do, but we are not the same readers we were. So our reading changes. The second thing I would say is something I heard Old Testament scholar Jim Sanders say in an intro to Hebrew Bible class more years ago than I'm going to admit, where one day he just stopped and turned around and said, if you are reading the Bible and it makes you feel good and warm and cozy inside, you can be sure you're reading it wrong. And, some years on, some decades on, I would quibble with that just a little bit. There are times, and this is one of them, when we do need to read, we can read for comfort, and there's nothing wrong with that. But one of the things that's important to me is to understand that the text speaks not just about other people and the things they have done or aren't doing. It also speaks about me and my community. And so I'm rather suspicious of readings that find their targets elsewhere. Another way to say it is I fully endorse what scholars call the hermeneutic of suspicion, but I also think the hermeneutic of suspicion has to start at home. I have to be on guard about my own tendency to reinforce my own presuppositions.
Right.
So I suppose one of the things that gets at is that I do have a strong sense that the text has something to say to me, and that I find when I stay with a text for a long time, so this is not something we can do on the fly, but when I have lived with a text for a long time, it always makes me uncomfortable somewhere. It always finds a way to question some of my presuppositions and to expose, to hold up a mirror to my own shortcomings. So that would be a place to start. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a rich discussion. Yeah, and I mean, one thing that this kind of strikes me generally about this, I'm going to switch to gallery view just so we can all see each other like the Brady Bunch now.
Right.
But one thing that strikes me about there's kind of this kind of excessiveness to the text. Like a lot of people imagine that Christians or any Bible reader can just kind of read whatever they want into the text, and that might be true. But if we take the text seriously, it can be like kind of like a dialogue partner, and it can sometimes pull us up short or ask questions we never really imagined that we would ask, or surprise us in a way.
Right. Well, one of my favorite quips is from Wayne Booth attributes this to Anonymous, and I think probably in this case, Anonymous is also Wayne Booth, great literary critic, who wrote once, "There are many ways to read any text wrong. There are also many more ways." Sorry, I did that wrong. There are many ways to read any text. There are also many more ways to read any text wrong. Mm-hmm. And sometimes in our urge to enjoy a proliferation of readings, we forget that we can just get there. There are readings that are just plain wrong.
Right.
Violate the text and violate the words on the page.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to hold up what you said about living with a text, because in my experience, I was a student of yours when you were at Princeton Seminary, and that was one of the most formative experiences, was that you live with a text. I teach course of study. I often remark about course of study students. And one of my first times teaching a class, I had a pastor tell me, that when he started, he used to spend hours preparing for a sermon. But now that he had been doing it for, a dozen years or so, he could pick up a text, get the text that morning and be ready to preach on it that afternoon. And I was like, no. And he was very proud of this fact. And I was like, no, I think this is what we're trying to teach against, right? That actually what happens is you need to commit to living with this text. You need to, in your book on Romans, you use the language of linger. You need to linger with this text. And it seems so opposite in our day and age of instant information, short abbreviated lists of the top 10 things you can do to gain weight or lose weight, whichever you're looking for, that you recommend a way of reading that is slower, more deliberative, and actually takes a lot of work. That's the other thing that I would hold up. So grateful that you're reminding us of that, and just wanting to say, in my own formation as a reader of sacred text, that's been very formative, as well as the command to always ask new questions of the text. I use that. If I should pay you for that, copyrighted.
I think it is copyrighted, in fact.
Yeah, royalties for every time I say it in one of my classes about the value.
I had a nickel.
Of asking new questions.
Yeah, maybe, Chris, that won't be obvious. That statement won't be clear to people who are listening in. But there is, in the field of biblical studies, a tendency to ask the same questions over and over and over again. And that's not a terrible thing. I mean, sometimes it's interesting to find out that in Paul especially, you're apt to find exegetical discussions about points that have been disputed for 1,500 years, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a venerable history, but sometimes you can turn a text around, ask a question a different way, or venture another question, and open up a whole new way of thinking about a particular problem. And we do tend to get stuck in a kind of rut. You know, I've actually heard people say, well, here's this text and here are the 4 problems about it. And no, you know, Paul didn't write a list of problems. The psalmist didn't write a list of interpretive problems. The psalmist wrote or composed, you know, a text for the worship of God. And so to start looking at it as just a list of scholarly problems is already a kind of reductionistic. It's an impoverishment of the passage.
Yeah, and I think for both of those, like the pastor who already knows what he wants to say, but also the scholar who already knows the problems. I mean, the problem is we already think we know. We don't allow ourselves to be surprised, and so your suggestion to linger, I love that. If the text isn't drawing up any new kind of questions in us, maybe we're the problem.
Yeah, and you know, it's very easy for the likes of us to say, oh, the pastor does this, you know, the pastor is in a hurry. But it's also the case that those of us who are in institutional settings are in a hurry because the dean is counting articles, right, and the dean is counting research papers and presentations. And you know, the tenure clock is ticking, or the promotion clock. So there is this sense of, I've got to get this done in a hurry. And it's counter to the text we have. So.
Yeah, a different kind of productivity, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's turn our attention now to the subject matter for this morning, which is Philippians 4:2 through the end, through 23. And our passage starts with the mention of 2 women, Euodia and Syntyche, who are mentioned in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 4. And we thought that it would be great just to start our discussion with these 2 women and what we might know about these women, and use that as a way to sort of get a wider picture of women in Paul's letters more generally. So, Beverly, who are these 2 women, or what do we know about these 2 women and their role in the Philippian community?
Well, you know, we know what Paul tells us, which is not much. I mean, and that's an important thing to say, isn't it? Because sometimes we get those questions and there's sort of a sense that, well, if we all consulted, you know, Plautus's history of the early church, we would know no, these are the sources we have. We don't have extra sources about, in this case at least. And I find it interesting. It would be interesting to go around and look at, say, commentaries over the last 50 years, because I think it's not unlikely we would, and I haven't done that with Philippians, it's not unlikely we would find references to the 2 women as evidence of how women are always squabbling, you know. I would bet that we would find some catty little remarks about women when it's pretty evident from what Paul says that they are leaders in this community, right? Yeah. The fact that they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel. Now, you know, when it comes to women, we tend to hear that sort of language as, oh, well, they helped set up the cookies for the reception. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I happen to like cookies myself, rather more than I should. And I'm happy to help set them up. But when Paul uses language of working in the gospel, that's pretty standard language for him that has to do with apostolic labor. with spreading the gospel, with teaching and preaching. So I think it's pretty clear that there is a conflict of some sort. Surprise, surprise, people have conflicts. But these are women in leadership, and they're important enough that he speaks out and identifies them, and is in need of their coming together over whatever the topic might be.
Yeah, I remember I wrote a paper for you on this very word in your Women in the Letters of Paul class, and I remember my mind just being sort of exploding when I realized that it was a sort of a special term, and he elsewhere applies it to people who most commentators would unquestionably regard as apostles, and yet here the mention of these women gives interpreters some reason to sort of waffle. Well, we know that they couldn't have played that role because they were women, and yet he would mention other people that we would definitely regard as in church leadership positions. And I just remember just how much my eyes were open just by looking at that one verb in Philippians.
Yeah, that's what you just mentioned, though, is pretty standard procedure that we assume we know about women and what they were doing or not doing. Mostly we think in terms of what they were not doing. And so when we see terms used of them, we always find ways to minimize them, to belittle. And the classic example of that comes in Romans 16, which I would love for us to talk about a little bit.
Please,
yeah,
let's do. Yeah. So one of the things that Paul doesn't say much about Euodia and Syntyche here, but he does say a lot about some women in Romans 16. Of course, it's not as theologically weighty as some people might think of other parts of Romans, and so they just skip past it. But there's some really important and vital information in Romans 16.
Yeah, there is. And that's why I typically start, when I teach a course on Romans, whether it's for a graduate seminar or for 45 minutes in a local congregation, I start with Romans 16, in part because Paul's letters, Philippians has the same effect on us. They tend to have such abstract language that it's hard to get a sense of a community. So when you start with the beginning and the end, and you get names of people and you can think about them, you can imagine a setting, then it's a little easier to get something concrete. Now, in Romans 16, Paul's not been to Rome. I think he's doing a lot of networking in this conclusion. Greet this person and that person. He mentions a lot of women. And for many of them, he uses this similar language of working in the Lord, or something even more specific. He starts by commending a woman by the name of Phoebe. And this is a very important description of her. He calls her a deacon. He doesn't call her a deaconess. There is a very specific Greek word, diakonos. And he also says she is a prostatis, a benefactor. And the word means in the first sentence, it means what it sounds like. She's a person who is supporting the work in some very specific, concrete way. Just another little note on the side about how to read. When I pick up a new translation of Romans or a new commentary on Romans, one of the first things I do is to look to see how these words are being translated. Because in the past, at least, diakonos was often translated as helper and or servant. And, diakonos is a term Paul has just used in chapter 15 to refer to Christ.
Right.
So let's at least think about these as having the same kind of referent. And a benefactor is not a helpmaid. A benefactor is a person who's paying your bills in some cases. I mean, that's the way this looks.
We would be right to think of it at least in intersecting with patronage, right? That she's his patron.
Yeah, she is a patron. He uses a very specific term that is the term for patron. And it's pretty clear that he commends her. She is the one who is bringing the letter. All right. So already you have blown the notion that women didn't go anywhere, that women had no roles. He does not mention a man with her. So either she is unmarried or widowed, or in some way she is financially independent. Yeah. She's the deacon of the Church of Cenchrea, which is the port for Corinth. So she is presumably with Paul in Corinth, in the circle of Paul. I'm not trying to say anything scandalous about her.
Sure, yeah.
She is in the circle around Paul. And, one of your first weeks you talked about collaboration in the writing of these letters. I imagine that as Paul is planning this letter, what people did was they gathered around and they writers read drafts of things that they were thinking. They taught in small circles. And I suspect that as Paul is planning this letter, Phoebe is involved in it. Yeah. At the very least, if she's taking it, she is the one who's been charged with interpreting it. Yeah. And I think she's the one who reads it in Rome. He doesn't name anybody else who could be doing it. So, you kind of have to be a woman like me to get how important this is, because Phoebe, as the first interpreter of Romans, in a line that stretches 2,000 years and is notably male, right, is kind of fun for somebody. And encouraging for some of us.
And we can say that not only sort of later in Christian history did some of these roles get obscured, the roles of women and leadership roles in the church. I mean, we could even see in some of the later kind of Deutero-Pauline, like the household code, which seems to obscure and cover over some of the leadership roles of women, perhaps even an interjection into 1 Corinthians 14, right? Telling women to be silent, which might even be an interpolation, right? An editor, a later editor. Right. But also in the history of scholarship, scholars have literally changed the text, right, yes, to try to demote Junia, but also Nympha, who in the letter of the Colossians, I mean, she runs the house church. Right. And she gets her name changed, right? I mean, can you comment on some of those actual physical changes to the letters?
Yeah, well, the most notorious is Junia in Romans 16:7, where Paul greets Andronicus and someone by the name of Junia. Now, this gets a little into the weeds, but in Greek, as you both know, the way that reads, it could be theoretically either a female name, Junia, or a male name, Junius. Mm-hmm. The problem is, there's a great book on this by Eldon Epp. The problem is that in the extant text evidence we have of names from the period, there is no evidence for a male named Junius and ample evidence for a female named Junia. And in the first 1,000 years of the church's life, it is assumed that this is a woman.
Right.
St. John Chrysostom, who was certainly no feminist, talks about, how fabulous this woman must have been to be recognized among the apostles. And clearly what happened, it's not so much that there was a change in the text, but people started to sort of invent this man. Yeah. Precisely because of what is said. And interestingly, even the King James has Junia. English translations up until the late 19th century most consistently have Junia. It's at the beginning of the 20th century, and I have yet to see a study. I think it's probably correlated with a reaction against the suffragette movement.
Wow.
That's total hunch on my part.
Sure.
But in early 20th century, all of a sudden we find assertions that well, this could be a woman's name, but because of the context, that is, because this person is called an apostle, it must be a man.
Yes.
Wow.
Because we assume that only males were apostles based on other parts of the literature and
right. Well, and it's important to say we assume that because of the book of Acts, right? But it's quite clear in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul knows of the 12, and then he says something about all of the apostles. Paul does not regard the 12 as the definitive group of apostles. If he did, he couldn't call himself one.
Right.
So it shouldn't surprise us that Paul thinks of other people also as having that name, in this case, Junia.
So just to sort of recap, we've got these women leaders mentioned in Philippians, and we've got these other women, and the list, there's more women in Romans 16 that are mentioned, but certainly Phoebe, who most likely had the role of delivering the letter, probably had her hand in shaping the letter, and was maybe the first reader or interpreter of Romans for the congregation or congregations there. And then a woman who's identified as an apostle. And this is all from the New Testament author who is most frequently accused of being the one to limit the women of role, the role of women in the church. And so I wonder if you could just, I promise we can go back to Philippians 4, but how do we make sense of, Paul's reputation as anti-women and these texts that suggest a very different picture of Paul?
Well, I'm not going to try to argue that Paul was a feminist, and we have to be aware of sort of finding what we want to find, right? I think we see clear evidence that there are women in leadership. I also think we see places where Paul, surprise, surprise, is shaped by his own era and has gender norms that reflect the era, and we shouldn't expect anything else. But this is, as far as our interpretation goes, this is clearly one of those places where you start determines what you will discover. If you start with the clear evidence of women in leadership in these letters, then you read certain other passages in a different way. If you start with those, as some people do, if you start with 1 Timothy, then you will inevitably go to Romans and say, oh, well, they really were just serving up the coffee. Or they were teaching. They were teaching, but they were only teaching the children. They weren't teaching adults. They weren't teaching adult males, say. So it is a matter that the texts are complicated, and they don't lend themselves to a kind of flat interpretation. So it is important, I think, to pay attention to where we start.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it seems like those kind of assumptions inform like the way that people even think about Priscilla or Prisca and Aquila and Nympha or Nymphus. These inform so much of our readings, but also the way that Paul is arguing about marriage in 1 Corinthians 7, and when Paul is talking about, he kind of goes off on his Second Temple Jewish interpretation, including Enoch, of like the relationship between men and women in 1 Corinthians. But then at the end of that says, but let's not argue over this. So it seems like Paul, for him, like he doesn't fit within the particular, like the typical assumptions of gender of his own day. I mean, he himself is an unmarried man working abroad and moving around, like Jesus in some ways, an unusual man for the period, but also seems to kind of have some typical assumptions in terms of gender, but also seems to be able to push in some ways beyond that and imagine, or at least participate in communities that themselves are moving beyond the typical notions of gender and power.
Right. I think, one of the things that I've been really interested in as well is the way in which he uses of himself, for himself, language that is that goes against gender norms. You know, he speaks of himself as a nursing mother. That's pretty interesting. So for me, what's important about this is the way in which, not that everything Paul says is consistent on this question, right. But that so many Christians, I find, especially women, but not only women, have experienced a kind of hardening with respect to Paul, a resistance to Paul on these lines, without understanding that the text is far more complicated and more encouraging than they might have imagined.
Yeah, there's almost blinders on, which have as much to do with the text itself and how the text maybe has been used or how they've perceived the text, that needs to be sort of dealt with. And
another one of those instances where we are shaped by what we've been taught. People have been taught that Paul says you can't do this. Well, then I don't like Paul. Right. Well, maybe the problem is not Paul. Maybe the problem is the person who was teaching you.
Yeah. I hear you. So these two women, Euodia and Syntyche, are leaders in the church. If they're being singled out by Paul, they probably have some power in the church. But then also they're encouraged to have the same mind, which that word we've seen happen a couple times in Philippians, which is what was described as what Paul wants us to have with Jesus in Philippians 2 with the hymn. So can you say a bit about like what does having one mind mean to you? We've talked about this a bit in previous weeks, but I think here in terms of the practical application, we see an actual situation here. What do you think Paul is encouraging these women to do?
I don't think we can be very specific about that in terms of what the conflict might have been over, but I do think it is this mind shaped by Christ, a mind that is amenable to considering the other, not to abandoning one's own view all the time. It's not a sort of suppression of the self, but I do think to have the same mind means to be willing to listen to the other, to engage on behalf of the other. It's really important not to confuse it with uniformity, which is the way it sometimes is used, and to use it as a kind of weapon to make other people come around to my view. But this willingness to have a shared mindset, that has values shaped by, well, the Philippians hymn would be a good start.
Yeah. I was reading, and my wife Catherine read this, and then I think saw a TV show that was made out of it. But it's a Modern Love, this column in the New York Times that is, talks about different ways that love works in the modern world. But there's this one column that was then turned into a TV show, I think starring Tina Fey, but about this couple that plays tennis together. Their therapist, they're having marriage problems, and their therapist tells them you should play tennis together, and they just start hitting the ball at each other as hard as they can, competing. And the therapist suggests to them, you should try to see if you could play tennis together as a team. Like, don't just try to beat the other person. And it was a metaphor for their life and their work together. It's not just that they had to be the same person. They could do even competitive things together, but can you see yourself as part of the same team in the midst of your striving and your struggle? And to me, that seemed to kind of resonate with a bit of what Euodia and Syntyche are maybe going through. But not that they have to be the same person, but
right.
Yeah, we're working together for something. We're struggling alongside each other for the gospel.
Yeah. I don't know where I read it or who said it, but that this idea to be of the same mind, to think the same thing, it has more to do with patterns of behavior and dispositions than it does with seeing things in the same way or agreeing on all of these dogmatic or theological principles. But really, it's a matter of pattern of behavior that, as Beverly, you suggested, is sort of exemplified in the Christ hymn, which I guess then we would, if we're doing a little reading behind the scenes or reading between the lines, we could wonder, is there is this a status? Is there an argument over status or about privilege? Because that would be sort of counter to the Christ hymn. But again, we can't know for certain. We would just have to say this is complete conjecture.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'm not fond of spending my time with just, making these things up. I would say that in Romans, when Paul goes through that long discussion about the conflict over food, it's not so much that he wants them to come to the same practice, right? He wants them eventually to come to the same mind. But then what does he do? He concludes that passage with a prayer. May God grant this to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's where our discussions of that need to go, which is not just, well, let's see if we can't play. I mean, I like that story very much of playing on the same team. But theologically speaking, we always know that if we're able to get there, it's because God has taken us there.
Right.
Yeah.
Not because we just tried a little harder every day. And I think we need that reminder of the deeply theological location of Paul's work, which is not about saying it's got to be the right doctrine or dogma or anything of that sort, but it is a kind of theological center.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we can shift a little bit now to the verses 4 through 9 or so. And Brennan, before we started going live, said this is sort of a hotbed for Christian aphorisms. If we were looking for Christian greeting cards, this would be the place to source material. And so rejoice in the Lord always, or I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But as you said at the beginning, we don't read Philippians today like we did 4 months ago. And so how do you see these exhortations sort of providing some framework for our response to life during and following COVID and this global pandemic that we're all a part of? How do these words sound for you in this context?
Well, you're absolutely right that it does sound a little bit like the place to go to get your Hallmark card, or your American greeting card, to get your little cross stitch, to put on the wall.
Right.
But again, we have to remember Paul's context, don't we? He was not writing when things were on the up and up for himself, right? He's writing this from a form of captivity. I was struck several years ago reading David McCullough's fabulous biography of John Adams, that toward the end of his life, John Adams wrote to his friend Benjamin Rush and said, rejoice evermore. I think that was the translation. This will be my doctrine of the perfectibility of man. And he was writing counter Rousseau and this whole notion that if you train up a person from youth, you can perfect the human can be perfected. And Adams is saying, not so much. Adams was not taken with that notion, but he was taken with this notion of always rejoicing. Now, that sounds a little saccharine. When Adams wrote that, he was himself in very poor health. He had lost a bitterly contested bid for re-election as president, and one of his own sons had died probably as a result of alcoholism. So this was a kind of determination. This was a declaration about where his life was located. My life is located in rejoicing in the Lord always, and I think that's not unlike what Paul is doing. Mm-hmm. We, in our flurry of interest over, over Paul's theology on the one hand, or over studying Paul's communities on the other, we sometimes neglect the extent to which joy, not happiness, joy, rejoicing, giving praise, giving thanksgiving, runs through Paul's letters. You know? And I think we shouldn't be surprised to see this here, that no matter what, we know who and whose we are, and we know how to say thank you. You know, and that is the first obligation of the creature, to delight in God.
Yeah. So one of the assigned articles that we have these two levels of this class, and for those that registered, one of the articles that I think Brennan found was by Greg Bloomquist on and it just really highlighted the pessimism of the age in which Paul lived, and just how surprising it would be, not only given Paul's situation in a prison that may not have been an ideal situation and would most likely lead to his death, but also just the general cultural world was one of pessimism. I mean, anxiety about dying and the reality of death, life expectancy being much shorter than what we have. Right. You know, we could talk about economic concerns, all of these other things, and the
kind of status.
Yeah, that Paul would sort of inject joy into his letters and into his life situation is, you know, I think we tend to live in a very pessimistic world by and large, or I mean a very optimistic world by and large. It's, you know, the old bootstraps myth, right? That, you know, everything's going to work out better. And just to hear Bloomquist argue for how different the first century world would have been was really powerful for me. To think about joy and rejoicing as really being a countercultural sort of command.
Yeah.
Yeah, and his way of talking about how like the Roman Empire tries to counter that pessimism with its victory, right? Pompous displays of power and excess and wealth, and the eternal youth of the emperors like Augustus, you know, like they're going to defeat death by either willing it away or their power or their wealth, you know, and how different it is for Paul, who's finding his joy through, you know, in the midst of what would seem like loss and grief, a period of loss and grief.
And by the way, I think this is not just Paul. I mean, one of the threads that you find in the book of Acts, in these disparate stories about the spread of the faith, is every once in a while Luke will say, they went on their way rejoicing. You know, they went on their way rejoicing. And we tend to minimize these passages and run right past them, but I think they're an important signal of not just what they thought things ought to be, but what was actually going on in these communities. There is this sense of delight in the word, and I think that's something we need to reappropriate. It's not sort of American bootstrapism or optimism. You know, if I try a little harder, tomorrow will be better. I'll do better tomorrow, you know. Well, that's not quite what Paul is saying. What Paul is saying is, I rejoice in the Lord, not in my own ability.
Yeah. And Beverly, as you pointed out earlier, it is a gift too that he mentions here. That you know, God provides, but we have to kind of look to God in a way. I mean, you know, we can ignore this gift, we can walk away from it, or we can embrace it. This gift of the ability to have joy in the midst of crisis, if that makes sense. Is that and
yes, right, exactly.
So I have a follow-up question, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, so you don't have to answer it. But I think you can answer it. I believe. So in verse 5, one of the things that we might say that grounds this exhortation is this warning, or this statement that the Lord is near. And we could talk for hours about Paul's understanding of the Lord's return, which is technically called the parousia, and whether or not it adjusts or changes. But we know that his sense of nearness in 50 or 60 is different than our sense of nearness. And so how do we read this, you know, sort of grounding that we should do these things because the Lord is near? And how do we read this as people reading this now 2,100 years later, or 2,000 years later?
Well, we have a couple of models of how not to do it. So let me deal with that first, right? One of the ways we ought not do it is by coming up with a timetable, right? which Christians have occasionally done. The thing that we have also done, and I think this is more dominant in mainline Christianity, Protestant Christianity in this country, is to pretend it's not there. You know, if we just don't notice that text, and I'm grateful to you for pointing it out. If we don't notice about the imminence of the return of Jesus, then maybe they'll go away. Well, of course, what happens is not that they go away, but that other people make a lot of them, and then we don't know what to do with that. I think we have to say, on this point, Paul had views that were simply not confirmed by history. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that they're not important to us, because there's a sense in which there is this horizon. Here I'm going to channel the work of my own teacher, J. Lewis Martin, who talks about seeing God's triumph on the horizon at a distance, even though what we see right here, and certainly it is now, is death and suffering and struggle. And it's not that this is like pie in the sky by and by, but we live out of that tension, and we know God's triumph is real, and that allows us to live in the present.
Yeah, that's good. It's a super. I mean, this is one of those places where it's so much easier just to ignore it and pretend like it's not there. Or I guess it's also really easy to live in this sort of timetable mentality that you know, and a lot of that is happening in COVID, right? A lot of it is people are certain parts of Christianity are saying, look, this is the end of the world, y'all. We've got all these signs. There may not be locusts, demon locusts, but there's, other things. And so prepare yourself, repent. The day of the Lord is here, which is again another sort of extreme. And the position that you're offering is much more nuanced way of dealing with it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and so Paul moves on from his exhortations, where he talks a lot about peace and that God is going to give peace. God is peace. God gives peace. This peace surpasses all of our understanding. We can't even understand it or grasp it, and so on. But it's there for us if we keep doing these things, and in a way, being open to receiving this gift of God's peace. But then he moves on also to talk about gifts, other kinds of gifts, the Philippians gifts that they have given him. And he seems to say two things here in verses 10 through 20, really, that he's appreciative of the gift, but he kind of wants the Philippians to stop giving him gifts. Can you say more, Beverly, about just Paul and gift giving in general, perhaps, but also about here? What exactly is, what does he want to do, or what does he want the Philippians to do?
Well, I think he relies in part, excuse me, on their generosity. I'm sorry, not all of the pollen is in Georgia.
Although a lot of it is, but yeah, right.
Yeah. We're happy to share. Happy to share.
Yeah, right. Thank you. You can keep that. I think he is Paul is in a bind about this, because on the one hand, he relies to a certain extent on their hospitality, on generosity, right? Mm-hmm. Gift giving, support of the ministry is crucial. And all of his letters, all of the letters that we recognize as authentic have something to say about financial support for the ministry, whether it's Paul's own ministry or the collection for Jerusalem, which we can come back and talk about if you want to. But there's also this fear that if he seems to be asking for money, then he's a charlatan, right? On the other hand, in 2 Corinthians, it becomes clear that some people have said he won't take our money because he knows he's a charlatan. So he's living in this little narrow swatch there between those who might be suspicious if he doesn't take money and those who are suspicious if he asks for money. And he wants to be self-sufficient, that is a goal of his, not to be regarded as relying on them, and yet he has to have that.
And so, yeah, there's a kind of benefactor. We talked about the kind of relationship and structures of benefactors, and like in Corinthians talks about Chloe's people, these kind of households, and seeing yourself as part of a household. In fact, there's a really interesting reference to Caesar's household that gives greetings here, which I wanted to be sure to ask you about. I mean, not that we can know anything about this really, but just to mention it is really fascinating. But also that Paul is financially dependent upon people. We talked about how he has a large, I mean, there's like some 40 people who are mentioned as being part of his group, and this group of spreading the gospel that needs resources. But that also, yeah, he is caught in a kind of a double bind. I mean, and like some pastors are, right? They don't want to ask too much for money, but they don't want to not ask for money. And it strikes me that Paul one time is in 1 Corinthians that he says that, like, he quotes Jesus, but it's not in the Gospels, but saying that, like, pastors should ask for money, basically.
Right. Yeah, that you can't get by without that. But the interesting thing is he never, I mean, even at 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, which is sort of the classic text
for fundraisers.
Paul as the fundraiser, right? Yeah. He always uses cultic language, which shouldn't be too surprising. But I think it's important for us to notice that also locates what he's asking for, not just in terms of what he needs. I need peanut butter on the table, I need to put food on the table, but it's also whose ministry is this, right? And it's also always for and about the gospel. And so the giving of it is a cultic act. It's an act of worship.
Yeah, it strikes me, and you mentioned the cultic language in verse 18, the fragrant offering, which also is the word Yodia for the name of the woman in chapter 4, verse 2. But the name of this kind of fragrant offering, and as an Old Testament scholar, this kind of sets me off thinking about the gifts in the Old Testament that were offered up on the altar, which was a giant barbecue. So if people like barbecue, we're getting near Memorial Day, right? But that was what it was, a giant kind of barbecue pit with a big grate on it and coals, and they would cook the food. And in the ancient world, most of this kind of barbecuing of food on altars was a gift to the gods, and the gods would be understood to eat them. And of course, I love that part of Daniel, Bel and the Dragon, the kind of additional part of Daniel that Protestants cut out to their own dismay, because it's a great part. But the world's first ever locked room mystery, where Daniel figures out that it's the priests who act of Bel or Baal who really are eating the food, right, at night. But in Leviticus and in other Old Testament texts, it's clear that God doesn't eat the food, that the priests eat the food, the priest families eat the food, and in fact, the people who have committed sins and the people that they have offended get together and eat the food together. So it's like a reconciliatory feast, but it's also something that really is for the community, but God smells it and likes that odor. And so that seems a little bit applicable here, right? It's a gift to God that helps the community. God doesn't need the money, but it's the giving of the gift that both sustains and helps the community, and it also in some way makes God happy or something.
Yeah, that's a wonderful connection. And I think it also, what you just said, helps us to appreciate why there are such intense problems over in Corinth about whether we're going to participate in these community gatherings. Yeah. Because on the one hand, if you are going to eat meat in Paul's world, it is likely to have been sacrificed to some god. Well, I don't believe that God exists, so bring on the pork.
Yeah.
Or the brisket. I live in Texas. On the other hand, for some people, that knowledge that this belongs to that God is deeply undermining. So we should understand that this was a terrible problem, a real problem, not just we say just a theological problem. It was it was a problem in many directions. Yeah. It was a social, it was probably an economic problem. If I can't go to that barbecue, Joe down the street is going to get in with the host, and I won't be able to. You know, I mean, there are multiple layers to this issue.
I once heard of a car salesman in Georgia who belonged to all of the churches in town and showed up to one of them every week, the Lutheran church, and, in order to sell cars to everybody. Yeah. So perhaps a cynical use of a sacrifice, but in any event, yeah. So that does, I think, help put the kind of gift giving in context in terms of what is expected, but also what people thought the benefits of some of this gift giving and sacrifice were. So that these are, in a way, when we give of ourselves to the community and to the work of the gospel, that we are participating in this offering to God that smells good to God in some way. Euodia, the fragrant scent. So in any event, I do want to ask, just before we finish, Paul ends with kind of a typical conclusion and benediction and blessing, but does anyone have any thoughts about the emperor's household? I mean, I know that the emperor's household is more than just like the Caesar's kids, it's this big structure that we talked about with patrons, and so it can extend in many different places. But why is Paul saying this? And he doesn't give many greetings from and to other people. I love, Beverly, how you point out that, there's no just a list of people, right? At the end of Romans 16, that's full of theology, it's full of practice, right, and it's really important. But here, Paul doesn't do that much with that space, but he does single out the emperor. Is there any reason, you think, or anything we can know?
This gets us into the question about where Philippians is written. Is it written in Rome? Is it written from Caesarea? Where is he? And how does he have contact? I suspect if we're talking about the emperor's household, we're not talking about, as you said, the emperor's kids or even their pals. We're probably talking about people in the slave quarters, but I don't know. Chris?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is one of those, I think, fascinating places where we can't get that far. I mean, beyond, I think the point is a good one, that the Greek word there, oikia, means more than just like our understanding of a nuclear family. It's not like it would be wrong, right, Beverly, to your point earlier, it would most likely be wrong to read this text as saying, wow, look, the gospel has even made it into Caesar's family. I think that would be categorically wrong. But to say, just as Chloe's people in 1 Corinthians probably means a very large group of people that are affiliated with with Chloe. Here, it's probably some large group that is associated with the emperor. And I think my hunch would be to go with the slaves as well. But I don't know if we can know anything beyond that.
That's interesting. It strikes me that there's a lot of citizenship and polis language throughout Philippians, and the mention of the Christ hymn, and Adele Yarborough Collins's suggestion that the Christ hymn may be kind of an inversion of an emperor hymn, what a theologos would say about an emperor. So here, the mention of the emperor, it's all suggestive. I don't know, but it was an interesting bit.
Yeah, actually, Aaron Mack also offers another suggestion in the comments that are these representatives who are holding Paul captive? Does the reference to the household of the empire who are with him, are these people that are maybe his guards? And again, it's maybe it's not it's within the realm of possibilities, but we probably can't know any more certainly.
So Beverly, we didn't tell you we were going to do this, but and so feel free to throw it back to us. But we have a couple minutes left here. We're finishing Philippians. Do you have any concluding words about the book of Philippians, the letter that Paul wrote? I mean, anything that we should, if you're going to sum it up in like a word or a phrase, what would you say to an MDiv student who says, "What's Philippians all about?"
Well, you could do a lot worse than rejoice in the Lord always, especially if you said rejoice in the Lord, the one who took on the form of a slave, right? The one who sacrificed himself, and locate ourselves in that story, that narrative about Jesus himself. And I think I would want to draw attention to the end of that hymn, if it is a hymn, and the declaration Not that believers are deified. I really find that quite problematic. But that declaration that we join ourselves with all those who bend the knee and who recognize Jesus Christ as Lord. I think that's where Philippians lives, even now, even now for Paul and even now for us. That we are, that's where we find ourselves.
Awesome. That's awesome.
Pure gold from Beverly Gaventa.
Pure gold. Beverly, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your time with us, but just so much of your wisdom and perspective on this text and about reading the New Testament and the Bible more generally. Before we close, Brennan, we should say one more time that starting on May the 31st, we will be transitioning to the Old Testament to study some of the book of Job. And we'll be giving more information as the weeks approach. But did you want to say anything more about that study on Job before we sign off?
Yes, we're going to have some amazing scholars to join us. Christine Yoder from Columbia Theological Seminary will join us on May 31st. We will also have Carol Newsom from Emory University, Chuliang Seao from Vanderbilt University, Brent Strawn from Duke, and Safwat Marzouk from Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary. So we have tons of amazing people who will be joining us for what I promise will be an interesting and perhaps we won't answer all your questions, right? So why do bad things happen to good people? I promise you, I won't tell you the answer to that at the end of Job. However, it'll be I think interesting book to study in this time, a time of crisis, a time of dismay, a time where we might want to ask if Philippians is one side of the equation, how do we rejoice in the Lord always? Job is the other side of the equation, which is what is our response when there is terror and suffering? So in any event, this is, I think, it'll be a nice bookend for the Old Testament to follow up on Philippians. So thanks to everybody for being a part of this. Yeah.
And I want to express our gratitude to the fairies or whoever controls technology. Apparently, I don't know, Brennan, if you know this, but there is like a worldwide outage of Zoom right now. We may be the only Zoom meeting that is happening. And so
wow.
We are grateful that technology was in our side.
You know what it was? It was Beverly Gaventa. That's what it was.
It together.
It was that, right. Yeah, it was that, the Lord said, if there's one Zoom meeting that's going to happen today, it's going to be this one. Well, anyway, Beverly, thank you so much for taking your precious time to share with us. We are delighted that you were here with us, and we look forward to maybe having you back again sometime soon.
Yeah, and thanks to all of those watching on Facebook and who will take advantage later. It's been a pleasure doing this. So we'll see you later, y'all.
Peace, y'all. Well, Beverly, so I stopped the live stream. So really, honestly, thank you so much. That was amazing. That was so fun. I learned a ton just sitting here, and thanks so much for just being willing to kind of take questions and dialogue.
Well, I had a great time, but I have to tell you, of course, the problem is next week I have to watch myself.
Oh, no, sorry. I hate that too. I never do it.
Almost nothing I would rather do.
I know.
Well, if it helps, you were wonderful, and you're going to really learn a lot from listening to yourself. No, I'm just kidding.
If you won't be offended, and even if you will, I will just say I'm very proud of you both.
Oh, well, thank you. I know. I appreciate it. I'm glad that this has been a helpful thing for churches in this time. But I mean, it's been kind of touching to me how many of our friends and teachers have wanted to join in and take part in this. This is like, I feel like, two kind of bumbling people trying to do something. And I'm grateful for venerable scholars to join with us.
Well, I think it's one of those times when people are looking for something they can do.
Yeah.
And there's so little people. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I have no skills, right?
yeah. I'm saying.
Brennan can at least play music. Beverly, I have zero skills. Like,
do you know what I'm doing every day now? At 2:45 every day, I have a 45-minute session with my grandson, who is 9. And I'm teaching him Greek.
Oh, that's awesome. Wow, that's amazing. Wow.
And So he now knows the alphabet, except that he cannot, God bless him, he cannot pronounce epsilon. Every single time he says espelon.
Does he like Pokemon? I know where he's getting that from.
Oh, I see. Okay. And now it really is humbling to try to explain the notion of conjugating verbs.
Wow.
I've kind of bumbled around. I've got a little book that's okay. It would be great if he were 18. But to try to explain why you need to say, I've made it into a chant. Oh, ace, a, an eta, usi, So he gets into this stuff. But that's my contribution to the world. Wow. So it's a long way around saying I think folks are eager to have something they can do to help. Yeah. And you've given us a venue, and I appreciate it. I really do.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, and I agree too. I mean, I was looking at Catherine the first day that everything got canceled, and I said, what can I do to help? I mean, some people are sewing, face masks, and of course, doctors and nurses, and I mean, we can donate some money to a food pantry, and then what do I, so yeah, this Catherine said, well, you teach, so I said, okay, all right, I can do that.
Well, I think it's great, and I'm delighted you're going to do Job. I don't know whether our class will choose to stay with that or not, but I would hope so. The funny thing about this was when I saw you were doing it, I suggested it to them, and then the first week I said, well, okay, I tried to get away from running it. The first thing I said, okay, the first week I'll lead the follow-up discussion. And then I thought, who are we kidding? There is no way I'm going to let anybody else.
Yeah, I hear you.
If you want to have a little follow-up discussion, then I'll be happy to lead that, because otherwise I'll lose my mind.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, right. You hear some people going, well, I think Paul hates women, so yeah. It's hard for him to shut up sometimes in church.
But you understand, of course, Chris knows, I'm not sure, Brennan, maybe you know too, that my son is our pastor. So I'm always a little careful that I don't try to do too much.
Right.
And I really think that's a problem in my head and nowhere else. But
yeah, I'm sure Matt would not mind at all if you stepped in and did as much as you wanted to, right? I mean, he seems to, well, maybe not. I don't know. Yeah, he's a very competent pastor, but I'm sure he would, he doesn't mind having one of the most famous New Testament scholars in his congregation.
Well, yeah, I don't have those delusions about myself. But anyway, you guys are doing a great job. And
well, thank you.
I look forward to Job, whether my class does it or not.
Yeah.
Hey, so can I ask you, what do you think of Alter's translation?
It's good in some places, and it's kind of loose in some others, and there's sometimes he's not a Hebrew philologist, so there's sometimes in some kind of quirks that he has that I think are really nice. I read his Genesis commentary, I read his Psalms commentaries. I think he's really good with thinking about poetic meter into English. So Proverbs and things that are in poetry, I think they're really neat. But I read his Job translation pretty carefully, and I like the way that he renders things poetically into English sometimes. But also, I mean, Ed Greenstein really ripped him up in a review, and I don't always agree with Ed, and Ed is very intense personally. However, I think he was right that Alter plays fast and loose with some of his philology. He just kind of finds an article from the 60s that he likes and then kind of goes with it sometimes. Yeah. So I treat it kind of like I treat Eugene Peterson's message. I think a lot of people just hate the message, right? But at the same time, I mean, every once in a while, it renders something in a really interesting way.
I wouldn't want it for my only Bible, but I don't mind having it. I don't own it, but I don't mind looking at it. The thing interesting, I decided I wanted to read it. And so every morning, my morning devotion now is, I'm up to, where am I? Isaiah, which may kill me. But I wrote Jack Lapsley about 3/4 of the way through Genesis. And I said, I think if in seminary I had this translation and his notes, I might have decided to go into Hebrew Bible.
Huh.
Yeah, it's poetically rendered. It's good.
So it's so engaging.
Yeah.
And the kinds of things he's interested in are the kinds of things that interest me. And so his little jabs at the documentary hypothesis industry, they kind of sit well with me, because that's, when I was coming through, that's what we got.
Right.
And it's just deadly.
I agree that in his attention to kind of storytelling and characterization and wordplay. I mean, the fact that he points out that there's wordplay happening, most translations don't care about that. So yeah, I mean, the Genesis notes in the HarperCollins are by Ron Hendel, and I don't think if you compare those two, I mean, Hendel knows a lot, is a really smart guy, but I mean, he's not thinking literarily.
He doesn't. Alter pulls you into the story. I mean, I think his treatment of the David cycle, again,
really good.
I'm not reading the Hebrew, right?
Yeah, no, but I love his David. I have his standalone David story. I use it in class. It
is so well done that you just think, wow, I can't wait to get to the next page, right? So
yeah.
That's just it. I'm really enjoying it. So.
Oh, I agree, and so I own all the individual parts, and then like the larger ones too. And I suggest them to students. I mean, just in the same way that every once in a while, I'll suggest the message. There are certain letters of Paul that the message is a lot better than others, and they have just some interesting ways of rendering text that are more engaging to some of my students than NRSV. But yeah, I agree. Genesis is probably his one of his best ones. But I do really like his Psalms as well. I mean, he'll render the poetry as a poem, and so that's really different. I mean, I suggest to students King James for the Psalms as well, just because it actually thinks poetically about the text. I think Alter's probably the first translation since King James to really think about poetry and storytelling on its own terms.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm just glad to have a chance to ask somebody. So.
Yeah. Well, thanks. And I agree though. What did Jack Lopson have to say about it? Did she like it or?
She does not like the way he treats female character. Some of the female language, I forget. But she likes it. So
yeah.
I think in general, picking up a different translation kind of plays with the circuits and is helpful to all of you, right? So just look at it differently. Although when I look at the Common English Bible on Paul, I want to tear out my hair.
Really, I haven't actually read Paul in Common English.
Yeah.
Have you wrestled much with David Bentley Hart's New Testament translation?
I bought it. I haven't spent much time with it. When I looked at, I was kind of hoping he would do something lively, and when I looked at it on Romans, I thought, not so much.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for my commentary, I have to produce a translation, and it's killing me.
Yeah.
It's just killing, because I think part of it is I keep changing my mind. Am I trying to write something that shows what the Greek is? Am I trying to render it in a way that is idiomatic? Am I trying to, what am I doing?
Yeah.
And I'm changing my mind. And I've said to several people, I think I would have been done with this thing 5 years ago if I didn't have to produce a translation. And I should have known better, but I really did not see that coming. I didn't see how awful that was going to be.
Yeah. I'm working on an Ecclesiastes commentary, and I'm toying with the idea of like a wooden translation, like the one that like kind of shows fidelity to the Hebrew, and especially the kind of Aramaic form of the Hebrew of Ecclesiastes. But then another that would show kind of an idiomatic, or kind of try to offer both. I know Leong's not going to let me do that, but I would like to.
Well, with Martin's Galatians commentary, he really did go toward paraphrase of his translation. What they finally decided, he wouldn't give it up. And what they finally decided was, okay, you can do that. And then the end of the book, they reproduced the NRSV.
That is so funny.
I think part of it also is, if you're writing a commentary, you're not trying to write a translation that people are going to use in worship.
No, yeah.
you're not competing to, it's not just a question of showing that I can translate the Greek or the Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
Although there is this little voice in my head that says on Romans, if you go toward paraphrase in any sense, the bastards are going to say, see, she doesn't know Greek.
Well, and I'm sure some people would, but the Ed Greensteins of the New Testament world, might try to come and get you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, the little boys of the Pauline scholarship,
I can imagine. Yeah.
That's a book I would like to write sometime.
Oh, you could do one of those things, kind of like, you publish it anonymously.
My screed about the Pauline scholarship world. So
I would love to hear that. that deserves to be on a podcast someday.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to have a few friends left. So. Hey, I've got to go to Sunday school. So
okay.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank you so much, Beverly.
Talking with you, and all best.
Yeah,
thanks. You too.
Talk to you later.
Chris, I'll talk to you about Job soon.
Yep, cool. All right.
Bye, y'all. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Beverly.